So you guys may remember a little review I did for Legion a while back, unless you're watching this from Twitch, in which case I will have a link for you in the description, where I made you guys a promise that after the end of this expansion's life cycle I'd do a little recap, to let you know if I felt the expansion kept pace or improved upon my initial impressions of it. Now that the expansion's final patch has finally been released, that time is now upon us. So how I'm going to be doing this is I'm going to be going through it one patch at a time, letting you know what each patch introduced and how I felt about them, and then give my impressions on the whole expansion at the end. Now, as weird as this is going to sound, I'm going to start this video off with patch 7.0, which, if you're allergic to numbers, is the initial patch that Legion started out on, so the version that I actually reviewed. But the reason I still wanted to bring up this patch though is because Emerald Nightmare came out during this patch shortly after my review was recorded. This was Legion's first raid, and for me it was a little bit of a mixed bag. It had plenty of good moments in it, which unfortunately I've lost my original footage of, and I didn't really feel like going through the old LFRs to get more footage. But there was stuff like Il'gynoth that had some really juicy lore and was a pretty fun fight, and the whole lead up to the final boss entering the Rift of Aln was a chilling part of the raid, and the ending with so many little secrets hidden throughout I thought was really well done. But then there were plenty other parts of the raid that just felt kind of bog standard. The second to last boss of the raid even gave me flashbacks of Archimonde from Warlords of Draenor. The entire plot of the Emerald Nightmare was weak before this raid even came out, ever since I've played the Druid campaign and this raid since my review. And it really just kind of makes you hate the Druid characters in the lore just because of how boneheaded they are for not having predicted this right since vanilla. And the only areas where Emerald Nightmare's story really shines is the little hidden gems like the Old God Whispers for Il'gynoth, and not the actual primary plot of the raid itself. Now then, getting into the game's actual patches, we have 7.1. Now for me, 7.1 had a lot of forgettable content in it. Going in order from least interesting to most interesting, first we have a new series of world quests that were introduced. Basically just more world quests were added to the open world. Nothing really particularly exciting. It did help a little bit in helping world quests stay somewhat fresh, but not really anything to go call home about. Next, the patch also introduced the continuation of the Suramar campaign. And this new series of quests, it was fun and it was good to have more stuff to do in my favorite zone, Suramar. But again, it wasn't really anything too exciting. New chapters were released weekly as sort of an episodic content type deal, and it was enough to keep me interested in playing each week, but nothing I'll really look back on and remember incredibly fondly. And next, continuing with the pattern of flat content with this patch, we have the new Trial of Valor raid. And now we knew going into this that this was going to be a filler raid, just a small low budget raid to keep us busy until the next big raid, the Nighthold, came out. And yet even for a filler raid, I feel like this one was a little disappointing. Trial of the Crusader from Wrath of the Lich King was a filler raid, but it's still probably one of my favorite raids in the game. This, on the other hand, it fulfilled its purpose of bridging the gap between the first raid and the next raid, but it just kind of fell flat and was uninteresting and forgettable. Not the worst they've ever done, but you're certainly not going to get people interested in raiding with Trial of Valor. And yet, for everything else this patch did wrong, there was one thing it did right, and it did it damn well. And that's the new multi-tiered Mythic dungeon Return to Karazhan. And while it did reuse assets from the original Karazhan, it still feels fun and brand new. The visuals still hold up to current WoW standards. Going back to this area certainly isn't a bad thing, considering the original raid was considered one of the best raids of all time. And I'll be damned if this dungeon doesn't make its fair share of twists on the original raid, taking you through one hell of an amazing ride as you journey through the twists and turns of Karazhan. It's an amazing experience from start to finish, and it's easily solidified its spot as one of my favorite dungeons in the entire game. This shit was fucking bonkers. And here's the point where I started to sort of drop off of WoW. Not necessarily by any fault of the game's content, but more just because I'm starting to get sick of the game's core mechanics. But I'll save the rant for the end of the video. So moving on to the next patch, we have 7.1.5. Now this patch added a smattering of small things to the game, such as Mists of Pandaria time walking, the return of the Brawlers Guild, micro holidays, which were kind of hit or miss to me, though they do help add a little bit more life to the world, especially when the good ones roll around, and a revamp to Blade's Edge Arena, a whole bunch of class changes and shit. Most of it stuff that I didn't really find had anything worth getting back on WoW for. But the biggest highlight of this patch was probably the Nighthold, the second major raid of the expansion. Thankfully, the Nighthold story was a bit stronger than the Emerald Nightmare, wrapping up the Suramar campaign, which was one of my favorite parts of Legion. But like with the Emerald Nightmare, the bosses and the entertainment value of the raid as a whole kind of had its ups and downs. Most of the raid was filled with your standard type boss fights, which are getting kinda old at this point, but there were still a few bosses scattered throughout that were a lot of fun to play. Though it could be biased for my personal enjoyment of the Suramar campaign, the fights that were fun seemed really cool to me. But for the fights that weren't, I don't know, maybe it could be that I'm just getting burnt out on the game as a whole, but the rest of the raid to me felt like it really dragged. I can't really tell you if it was the burnout that caused me to dislike a lot of the raid, or if it was the raid that caused me to get burnt out on raiding. Either way though, it's time to move on to the next patch. Patch 7.2. On the subject of burnout, this is the patch where I started to actually get burnt out on the game as a whole, and not just raiding. This patch added first of all the Broken Shore, a landmass of boring black and green color palettes that added very little to the game in the way of fun, simply serving as a place for Blizzard to dump more world quests. It also added Legion Assaults, which hardly lived up to the Legion Invasions from the pre-patch event, instead feeling more like a faction tagging mess of new world quests that were only available at certain times. This patch we didn't get a filler raid like we did last time, and instead we only got one new dungeon, the Cathedral of Eternal Night, which, while it was visually impressive, it turned out to be just another boring slog of new content for this patch. It certainly doesn't compare to the return of Karazhan, and it absolutely did not hold up the patch like Karazhan did for its patch. Instead, it and the entire patch kinda seemed to fall on its face for me. But on a side note, this patch did add a sweet new dance animation for the Murloc model, so it has that going for it at least. And then we have the 7.2.5 patch, which added the Deaths of Chromie scenario, which I didn't have a chance to do, even though I heard good things about it, and it also added more micro holidays, and then it marked the launch of the Tomb of Sargeras raid. Which, and again, this might be just bias out of getting burnt out on the game, but I really thought this raid was the weakest in the entire expansion. Every boss mechanically felt like your bog standard formulaic raid boss, and the visuals in both the bosses and the environment left a lot to be desired. Bear in mind though, ever since the Nighthold I'd stopped being interested in regular raiding, so I only played through this raid in LFR. So the difficulty of the raid isn't really being a factor in my judgment. But the way I see it, if the difficulty is the only thing that makes it fun, then it's not a well-designed raid. And the Tomb of Sargeras didn't really offer anything fun or interesting compared to other raids of the game, not only just this expansion. Now coming right out from my two least favorite patches of the expansion, now we have patch 7.3, where personally I felt like they started to kind of turn it around a bit. This is where they added the new continent of Argos and all the content that came along with it. Among this is first of all the invasion points, which still weren't exactly the most exciting thing in the world, but they were a welcome upgrade from the pointless side content of the Broken Shore, and did help break up the monotony of just doing world quests whenever you're in open world. It also added a new dungeon, the seat of the Triumvirate, which honestly was the low point of the patch for me, since 90% of the dungeon was just reusing a phased version of an open world area, and the difficulty felt incredibly undertuned, even easier than the open world content of Argos. And I know I just said earlier that difficulty shouldn't matter when determining quality, but any kind of group content should always be harder than the open world content it's derived from, or else transitioning from open world to this dungeon will feel like kind of a snooze fest, which is exactly what happened with the seat of the Triumvirate. On the other hand though, I cannot say the same thing about the final raid of the expansion, and Taurus the Burning Throne. In terms of its bosses, Taurus was the opposite of the Nighthold for me. Most of its bosses felt fun and interesting, with only one or two duds. While the visuals in the beginning of the raid felt kind of flat with more of your blacks and greens of the Legion, it really started to pick up its act as you got further to the end, where they started to offer some terrific looking environments for you to ogle at. And with a satisfying conclusion to the entire expansion, following the pattern of the amazing cutscenes we saw for the rest of the questline this patch and this whole expansion, it's gotta put Taurus at the top of my list for the raids this expansion. But unfortunately, as fun as the open world content was for this patch the first time around, the incredibly small size of this new continent, and by extension the lack of variety in the new invasion points and the world quests found within, led to Argos getting real old real fast. But because of the raid, and because I actually had fun the first time around, it's a lot more than I can say for some of the other patches this expansion, and I'd still say overall I really enjoyed this patch. And also as a side note, since I forgot to mention it earlier, this patch also introduced new casting animations for most of the caster classes in the game, which is a welcome improvement and something I complained about in my original review, though hunters are still shit out of luck. And alas, we come to the final patch patch of the expansion, patch 7.3.5. Now this patch only adds really two major features. The first is the Epilogue questline for Legion in Silithus. Now while they call it an Epilogue for Legion, it feels more like a prologue to Battle for Azeroth, the next expansion coming up. As a result, it's all about the stupid faction leaders making stupid choices in order to force the faction war into relevance again. And silly faction war rant aside, they've decided to go with the episodic launch schedule of this questline like with the Nightborn campaign, but this time we don't have a clear schedule of when the new chapters are going to be released. And now more than 2 weeks after the launch of this patch, we still only have the first chapter of this campaign to go through. With this kind of ass-backwards launch schedule for the new chapters, I can already tell that this is going to be the most hardcore drip feed of content we've ever seen. And it certainly doesn't help that they've announced nothing at all about when the next chapters are going to be released, and the only information they have released is that the new battleground promised to be arriving in this patch will only be available once the story in Silithus unfolds, quote unquote. So that especially sucks if you're a PvP player, thank God I'm not. But now on a slightly more positive note, the other thing this patch introduces is a new scaling system and leveling revamp. Now the first thing this changes is now mobs in the open world have a little bit more health, making it so you actually have time to use your rotation and abilities against them and learn your class as you're leveling up, injecting some actual gameplay and fun to the leveling again. And for the first time in years, it actually makes the low-level dungeons feel like dungeons again, with teamwork and mechanics and everything. And the second thing this changes is now every zone will scale up to a certain maximum level within its bracket. So now all the 1 through 60 zones will scale up to level 60, all the Burning Crusade and Wrath of the Lich King zones will scale up to level 80, all the Mists of Pandaria and Cataclysm zones all the way up to level 90, until you get to Warlords of Draenor and Legion where it's all properly tuned as it is. And I gotta say, this leveling revamp is probably one of the best things that's ever happened to the game. And it comes just in time for the new allied races which you're now able to play as if you pre-ordered the next expansion. Which leads me to rant time. I did not pre-order the next expansion, and I'm on the fence about whether I'm going to get it at all. Yeah, I make no secret that I do not like the faction war, which is going to be the primary focus of the next expansion, but that's far from my only reason. Like I said before, I'm getting burnt out on the game in general. The boring tab targeting combat, the formulaic boss designs, the random combinations of stack up, spread out, burn the ads, burn the boss, get in the shit, get out of the shit, interrupt this, don't interrupt that, tank swap at 5 stacks, sell your soul to a raiding guild, suffer through pugs, or resign to LFR. The entire foundation of the game itself. That is what I'm getting sick of, and that is why I'm not sure if I want to get the next expansion.
I guess nothing is immune to obsolescence in the end.
Now while Legion has set the game going in the right direction and I did overall enjoy the expansion, I personally feel like it's too little too late. Especially after having so much fun with other games like Dragon's Dogma Online, which I gushed about in another video. So unless like a few situations like my guild re-rolling Alliance all of a sudden, highly unlikely by the way, or if when Battle for Azeroth launches and there's really absolutely nothing else for me to play and do a video on, then maybe I'll get the next expansion. Otherwise I'll be joining Khadgar and I'll be sitting this one out. And so that is the end of this video. If you're watching from Twitch, be sure to follow me if you like this video and want to see more of my shit. If you're watching from YouTube, like and subscribe and all those other buttons and shit. And for both of you guys, if you want to support my channel, be sure to tune into my streams when I stream, and also you can go to patreon.com/themurloc and you can become a patron there. And until the next time, I'll see you guys later.
But from you, I have learned patience, tolerance, and faith.